Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton recently went on an interview and described slavery as a quote-unquote necessary evil. And the thing that everybody's using to defend him is this idea that, oh, well, he's just quoting the Founding Fathers. And I'm going to show you the quote in just a second. You can see why his sort of Tom Cotton defenders would think that. But given the broader context and how he was using the quote overall, it's quite clear that that's not exactly how he meant it. So let me give you guys the context. So for the past couple days, Tom Cotton has been working on a bill, trying to write a bill which would defund, cut funding from schools which try to teach the 1619 Project. Now, if you don't know exactly what the 1619 Project is, it's essentially a program curriculum written in conjunction with the New York Times, and the idea is to reorient American history around the original sin of slavery and try to explain how the history of slavery is so deeply and intimately intertwined with the history of America that you can't sort of differentiate them, right? You can't just have, okay, chapter 9, which talks about the American Revolutionary War, and then chapter, maybe part of chapter 11 then teaches about slavery and the wrongs of slavery. No, you have to intertwine them together and explain it in conjunction. So for instance, in the case of the 1619 Project, how they try to tackle that problem is by just reorienting the founding of America, reorient American history. So the year 1619, as opposed to 1776, is the year which we start with. So for instance, the year 1619, as you know, is a reference to when the first African-American slaves were arriving to the Virginia colony. So that's what the 1619 Project is. That's all it is. That's all the 1619 Project is. It's an attempt to explain how slavery and racism is deeply intertwined with American history, which is, by the way, just a fact. And so it's an attempt to have an integrated history in that sense, right? So that's the attempt of 1619 Project. And Tom Cotton saying is he doesn't want to have anything to do with that. So his idea is to cut funding from schools which try to teach the 1619 Project to children. So you can see here this quote about it here, how Tom Cotton is now, or this headline here, how Tom Cotton is now facing a lot of criticism. A lot of people are calling him out for his remarks in conjunction with the 1619 Project. This was the outlet here where he first had the interview, and this here is the quote. So Tom Cotton here saying, and this is the full quote for this particular section here, but here Tom Cotton saying, quote, "We have to study the history of slavery and its role and impact in the development of our country because otherwise we can't understand our country," Tom Cotton says. So far you're like, okay, well, all right, then why are you criticizing the 1619 Project? Then he goes on to say, "As the Founding Fathers said, it was a necessary evil upon which the Union was built. But the Union was built in a way, as Lincoln said, to put slavery on the course to its ultimate extinction." So you can see there Tom Cotton basically saying that yes, slavery was a necessary evil for this country, as the founders said, but that doesn't mean that we should have to teach the intimately tied relationship of slavery and racism to the history of this country to our children. That would be one step too far. Why? He says, well, look at the quote from Lincoln here, that the path to the extinction of slavery was set out in the founding of this country, and so as a result, our country is good. And if you go on and read more quotes from it, he basically says that our country is finally good, and so we shouldn't have to teach this to children, that teaching this to children gives Americans the wrong idea about the history of this country. But that's absolutely wrong. In fact, it is true that in order to have gotten the agreement of a number of southern states such as South Carolina or Georgia to go along with, the Declaration of Independence, and much more so the Constitution after the Articles of Confederation, was protections of slavery. So the compromise of slavery was clearly the evil sin of this country. It was the founding sin of this country, and it was so deeply intertwined, this country would not exist had it not been for racism and for slavery. In that sense, yes, slavery was a necessary evil for this country, but that is in no way, no way at all a justification for not teaching children. In fact, it's a justification for teaching children more about the sins of slavery, the sins of racism, that are at the very core and foundation and history of this country. Because, it is true that in 1807, the slave trade ended and it was set out in the Constitution. That was part of the negotiations for the writing of the Constitution. That, look, if we're going to do this Constitution thing, then we've got to end the slave trade. Because, for instance, during the Revolutionary War, the Pennsylvania General Assembly voted to end slavery. And then shortly before the Peace of Paris was signed, a Massachusetts judge struck down slavery. So there were anti-slavery states that, by the way, were oftentimes still racist, but there were anti-slavery states, and they weren't going to get into a union which required them to be pro-slave. But then the pro-slave states, especially like Carolina and Georgia, those states weren't going to get in a union which required them to get rid of their quote-unquote property, because they thought, oh, well, we have to protect the rights of our property. right? That's what they said. That's what they said. So yes, our country is inextricably, inevitably, and entirely tainted with the sin of slavery. There would be no America were it not for racism, were it not for slavery. But that is not a justification for racism, and it is not a justification for slavery. In fact, it is why we have to work extra, extra, extra hard in this country in order to root out racism, which we are still struggling with today. Now, that's not to say, I want to be clear, that's not to say that the 1619 Project is absolutely perfect, because as I was saying, we have to still work today in order to root out the sins of slavery, and one of the major criticisms, which I actually do agree with when it comes to the 1619 Project, is that it doesn't go far enough in history. So it generally stops around the 40s, maybe it talks a bit about sort of the civil rights movement and the like, but it doesn't continue into today, where, for instance, there's voter suppression and oftentimes election fraud, in which the voters who get purged are oftentimes minorities, especially black individuals who are getting purged from ballots, or African Americans who have a difficult time voting in this country. Or, for example, how prisons are disproportionately to minorities, or the disproportionate effects of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. This stuff is still going on today. Why, though? Why, you might ask, what might the 1619 Project not go into contemporary stuff that's going on today? Well, because then you're going to mention specific politicians and the specific things that they did, including, by the way, Joe Biden, and some of the stuff that he was involved with when it came to the crime bill. So you can't, like, guys, the thing is, look, there's no reason why we should be cutting funding for schools who teach the 1619 Project. I think that the 1619 Project is a very, very good step, especially compared to the kind of history that I was taught in school and that a lot of children are still taught today. So it's a definitely right step. But I'm not here to say it's perfect. That's my only point here, right? That's my only point here. I think that the 1619 Project could go further. And I do think, by the way, that it is a good thing to teach children from a very young age the way in which slavery was deeply intertwined with the history of this country. All right, so that's my point here. And it isn't the case, as Tom Cotton suggests here, that because slavery was a necessary evil, it means that, and finally, America is good, he argues. Finally, that, oh, well, we shouldn't have to fight slavery and fight the sins of racism constantly, because no, it means more so that we have to fight it harder than just about any country in the history of the world. And by the way, it actually goes further than that. The sins of slavery are not only political sins, because that's one of the other criticisms of the 1619 Project, which is that it primarily focuses on political sins which relate directly to slavery, but not necessarily the economic angle in the way in which capitalism was set up in this country and was finally rooted in and required slavery in order to function properly. So, for example, early on in the country, especially in the 1830s, oftentimes the North did rely on the product and cheap cotton which was brought in from the South, so that then they could, manufacture it in their factories and then send it off. And so oftentimes economic development and the concentrations of capital which accrued in this country were only necessarily as a result of slaves. And oftentimes it was the same case in England, where, prominent slave ports then became prominent centers of capital as well. So, this isn't a case where we can just, divorce them together, or say that, oh, well, there's one, all of the sins of racism were related to, actions that the government or that racists in the government took. No, it's deeply interconnected in every single way, in the way in which property has been distributed in this country, the way in which wealth has been distributed in this country. All of it is deeply related and deeply rooted in slavery. So we have to reconcile this. We have to fight this stuff. We can't just ignore it as Tom Cotton wants to. So no, the fact that slavery was a necessary evil in this country is not justification, Tom Cotton, to sit around and say that, oh, well, we don't have to teach the sins of slavery to our children, because no, actually, Tom Cotton, it means that we have to teach it more. We have to fight it harder in this country more than most any other country in the history of the world. All right, you guys, that's the video. If you liked it, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.